But then there was fire. And with fire came disparity. Heat and cold. Life and death. And of course, light and dark.
Hi, my name is Dan Smash and welcome to Dude Quest. This is our Dark Souls special. It's a series that's been a long time in the making and one that's morphed into a beast much larger than I'd first imagined it would be. So with that in mind, I've split it into 4 parts, the first of which you're watching right now. Now, I've had the pleasure of pooling the collective talent of some really awesome contributors, so hopefully it might just be something that you find at least a little bit entertaining, especially if you're a Dark Souls fan. So why now, I hear you ask? Well, with Dark Souls 3, the natural concluding part to the series, releasing in early April, now seems like the perfect time to cast our eyes back over a collection of games that exists as some of the finest examples of video gaming goodness. We'll be looking at how an originally troubled title went on to become a multi-console spanning hit, often cited as one of the greatest modern games of all time. We'll see how From Software's current president and Mr. Dark Souls himself, Hidetaka Miyazaki, went from disillusioned corporate software stooge to the creator of a game that would see many cite him as a genius of games design. So strap in and relax as we commence the Dude Quest Dark Souls special. What if I was to tell you that the Dark Souls series didn't start with Dark Souls Part 1? Mind blown, right? Now, I'm sure that over-eager of you out there are already muttering, well, yeah, Demon Souls was, obviously. And yes, that is true. Demon Souls did indeed precede Dark Souls as the first Souls game. But there is another game, or games rather, that came even before Demon Souls. And those games, of course, are the Kingsfield series. Kingsfield was From Software's maiden entry into the video game market, and was released almost at launch for new console on the block, the Sony PlayStation. Interestingly, before Kingsfield, From Software existed as a company that, bizarrely enough, made office software. It's really insane to think that a company that would become responsible for some of the most epic high fantasy games on the market started life from such mundane beginnings. Although admittedly, I've heard their Abyss Watcher's auditing software was something truly transcendent. I'll leave now. Kingsfield was a very early, nay, maybe even the first console example of a fully 3D RPG, one which unusually played from a first-person perspective. Upon release, it was received fairly well in its native Japan, and while the first game never saw release in the West until much later, the game did well enough to spawn a further 3 sequels, the most recent of which on the PlayStation 2. Now, before you get all bent out of shape and say Kingsfield isn't a Souls game, it's got no Miyazaki, it's got no XP currency, and it certainly has no Souls in the title, just hear me out. Now, I know the Kingsfield series may not technically be a Souls game, and you're right about all of the above. At the time of the first game's release, Miyazaki wasn't even on the pathway to becoming a games designer. He was still at university studying for a degree in social science of all things. Doesn't matter. To me, the fact remains that the Kingsfield games are, at their core, the first of the Souls series. Why? Well, let's take a look. Published by From Software, the games employ a pattern of gameplay so strikingly similar to Dark Souls in their thematic behaviour that you can't help but see the franchise that would be born from out of the series' ashes.
Kingsfield was this game, much like the Souls series, they shared a lot of commonalities. They were incredibly challenging but well constructed. They had a lot of build variants of how you wanted to build your character, and you would pay for any mistakes you made in town. Like if you assaulted someone, you killed them or anything like that, they wouldn't come back.
The games themselves take place in a fantasy kingdom, a kingdom with only a scarce amount of backstory that you as the player are left to fill in through playing the game. And how does the game ask you to do that? Through exploration, a policy similarly employed by Dark Souls many years later. The similarities don't end there. Dark brooding ambience? Check. Small numbers of inhospitable NPCs? Check. Difficult gameplay where a studied methodical approach is rewarded over gung-ho recklessness? Oh, you better believe check. The games even contain some characters and items that would go on to become important parts of the Souls canon, such as a white scaleless dragon, which to me is clearly Sif, and the Moonlight Greatsword. Even back then, From Software were creating games that were uncompromising in their execution. The Kingsfield franchise acted as a prototype for the Souls series, unafraid even all those years back to swim in a direction opposite to the games that were flooding the market. The last game in the series, Kingsfield 4, was released on the PlayStation 2, and while that title was no doubt important in forging the path for Souls games to come, there was another title released on the same console that would prove even more important, not just to the Souls series, but to From Software themselves. That game was Eco. Although not a commercial success, the title was a critical darling of the gaming universe. In it, you take control of a titular hero, a young boy whose task it is to escape a castle from which he's been imprisoned, doing so whilst also simultaneously escorting out a young princess. The game itself is a tour de force of minimal design, carried out in such a way so as to reduce the elements of gameplay that might otherwise interfere with the game's setting and story, thus increasing the game's ability to completely and totally immerse the player. Eco exists as a mystical fairy tale, set along a stage of aging castle ramparts. The story goes that upon playing it, something just clicked in Miyazaki, who, again I must stress, at this point wasn't even involved with video games with regards to his working life. In an interview from 2015, when recounting his experience with the game, Miyazaki said, "The game awoke in me the possibilities of the medium. I wanted to make one myself." Playing Ico, you can without a doubt see the influence it's clearly had on the Dark Souls games. The atmosphere deep with foreboding, the monolithic yet crumbling fortress around which you have to navigate, it's all very easy to see the influence it clearly had on Miyazaki. So, what did Miyazaki do? Well, as a 29-year-old looking to change career, his options were pretty limited. Fortunately for us, From Software decided to throw their future president a homeward bone. Miyazaki worked on the Armored Core series for much of his early years at the company, and clearly earned enough clout doing that, so that when the time came that he heard of a game called Demon Souls that was struggling through development, he felt confident enough to go after it with both hands. The man himself said, "The project had problems, and the team had been unable to create a compelling prototype. But when I heard it was a fantasy action role-playing game, I was excited. I figured, if I could find a way to take control of the game, I could turn it into anything I wanted. Best of all, if my ideas failed, nobody would care. It was already a failure." Miyazaki apparently came in and changed everything about it. So much so that his pivotal role in the series' creation earned him the moniker Mr. Souls in the From hallways. So it was that Demon Souls was released in Japan. Something it did with precious little fanfare. Looking back now, of course, this is a very little surprise. After all, here was a game that was decidedly against the grain of video gaming trends upon its release.
I remember when I first came across it, it was like a link on GameSpot, and they're like the hardest games for PS3. And I'm like, oh, so I clicked on it and I went through the list and Demon Souls was on there. I'm like, oh yeah, that looks pretty cool. And then that day, I went shopping and I came across it. It was like $25, and I'm like, you know what? Why not? Let's try it out. So I picked it up and I played it, and oh man, was it ever hard. It was good, but it was hard, and I must say it's actually harder than any of the Dark Souls games I've played for sure.
In an era where games were becoming easier and easier to the point of being dumbed down, diluted by maddening tutorials and bloated plots, Demon Souls acted as the perfect antithesis to this trend. It wasn't trying to hit as big a demographic as possible. It was simply trying to be the game that it wanted to be. It sold around 20,000 copies in the week of its release, far fewer than publisher Sony had hoped for. But then something happened. People began talking about this new game. A game that demanded that its players master its complex armour and weapon systems or face severe punishment. The word was out, and it was spreading like wildfire. A vibrant community sprouted up almost overnight, with people taking to forums to discuss their strategies and lore finds. You have to assume that this was no happy accident, but instead was actively organically grown by design from the get-go. Evidence of this tactic bleeds out from the game's at the time unique feature, wherein players were able to leave messages for each other in the gaming world, thereby weaving social mechanics into a game that was otherwise a strictly single-player experience. Within a few months, sales had passed the 100,000 mark, and the game was able to secure a publishing deal in the West. This is how Dark Souls was born.
So we both played Demon's Souls the day it came out.
It was a rather fun adventure. Cameron called me, or I was probably texting him, something, either function. It's like, I got this new game, and he was telling me about it, and I ended up going over to his house somewhere around like 8 o'clock at night. And I was there until 5 o'clock in the morning, at which time I was promptly kicked out of his house by his mother.
It's 5 in the morning, Matthew. You have to go.
But yeah, so we played Demon's Souls first. There's a lot of mechanics in that game that were really weird that have been abandoned since, like character and role tendencies.
Basically, depending on your tendency, either white or black, basically it came down to dictated what you could potentially get in the game.
And if you had a black character tendency, you would run into more red phantoms, which are really big now, but we have like grave lording and things like that influence what kind of phantoms you're invaded by. But back in the day, it was your character and world tendency.
Demon's Souls itself is a fantastic game, albeit a little less polished by today's impossibly high standards. That said, graphical capabilities and production budgets have increased fourfold since it's released, so it's understandable. That said, it's still a completely enjoyable experience, playing it all these years after its initial release. The story, so typically Soulsian, sees you dumped into the troubled kingdom of Boletaria, a realm plagued by curse and strife, and it's up to you, as in all Souls games, to battle your way to the game's fated conclusion. Without spoiling the story, it's a tale much more rooted in pulp fantasy than the Dark Souls games that came after it. This sword and sorcery type narrative is of little surprise given Miyazaki's open acknowledgement to the influences of game books like Sorcery and Fighting Fantasy. It's a land of high fantasy, of demons and dragons, of knights and kings. It's a land ripe for exploration, the lore of which brims deceptively beneath the surface, unintrusive but most definitely there. It's a tactic, a way of storytelling if you will, that's been upheld throughout the entire series, and it's one that, as previously mentioned, that has given birth to a ravenous fanbase, a fanbase who were only too happy to lap it up before taking their findings online to discuss and explore further with like-minded souls.
One of the other really cool things about the way the story is told, or it's almost not told, it's just laid out and you're for people to discover, is the way it fosters a community of people who are all talking about it and people who are interpreting it differently. You know, who are these characters? What is their significance? What do I think about it? What do I think about this? That's something that this game allows. You know, interpretation, and people will come up with a theory, and other people will say, no, I think that theory is wrong. But throughout it all, people are talking about it, and then you have the way that other people are helping other people. It's a kind of game that going and checking the wikis doesn't feel like you're cheating or getting an unfair advantage, because you can always just look at a little bit. You think, oh, I don't know what's going on, I don't know where I should go. You can just find a tiny bit and it'll just be that little spark.
Demon's Souls isn't simply the precursor to Dark Souls. It is the living, breathing embodiment of the Souls game's entire genesis. A game wholeheartedly linked to the worlds of Lordran, Drangleic, and Lothric, but one whose strength of vision is enough to let it stand up on its own 2 feet. And people love it. While I mentioned it's not a game as fondly looked at as the Dark Souls entries per se, the people that do love it adore the game, seeing it as the best entry in the entire franchise. And you don't inspire that kind of worship without being a genuinely fantastic title. And so Demon's Souls came, and it conquered. Sure, From Software didn't have a world-beating multi-million unit sell blockbuster on its hands, but what it did have was a seed from which a mighty saga was ready to spurt. Miyazaki had made a name for himself. With one title, he'd gone from a relative unknown in the industry to someone that people were actively watching to see his next move. While the signs were clearly there to see, I imagine few would have predicted that his next creation would be a full-blown gaming masterpiece. And that is part 1, folks. I sincerely hope it was to your liking, and if it was, hey, why not show your support and throw us a sub? If you did, well, it'd be just lovely. Until next time.